Execute Protocol 0.
I thought this was the end, but maybe there's still a chance.
What would you do if the person you saved with your own two hands 17 years ago, in a place where neither of you were supposed to live through the night, became the most powerful man in the country, and the only thing standing between you and your job was a man who had never once bled for anyone but himself? Hold on to that question. By the end of this story, you will know exactly what Nurse Leona Barrett did with the answer, and you will understand why some debts take almost 2 decades to come due and why, when they finally do, nobody can stop them. At 7 in the morning, the security phone at Harbor Crest Hospital rang exactly once. HR Director Denise Harlan picked it up expecting a supply vendor, or maybe an angry family member calling about visiting hours. Instead, a voice she did not recognize came through the line, calm, unhurried, flat as still water, the voice of a man who had said far harder things to far more dangerous people. 4 words. Nothing else. Get her back. Today. Then the line went dead in her hand. Denise stood alone in the hallway holding a phone that had just been used by the President of the United States, and she had no idea yet that the woman he was talking about was already sitting in a parking garage 20 minutes from that building, folding down the flaps of a cardboard box, believing her career at Harbor Crest was finished for good. It was not finished. Not even close. What was about to happen inside that hospital would become the loudest, strangest, most talked about 72 hours in its entire history, and every bit of it would trace back to 11 minutes that happened the day before, in a glass conference room on the 3rd floor. Subscribe before we go any further. If stories about quiet women who turn out to be the strongest person in the building are the kind of thing you come back for, subscribe right now, because this one only gets bigger from here, and I promise you will not see the second half coming. 24 hours before that phone call, Leona Barrett sat across a glass conference table from the 2 people who had already decided, quietly and without her knowledge, that her 12 years at Harbor Crest were over. Graham Rieck, CEO of Harbor Crest Hospital, did not look at her when he slid the termination letter across the polished surface. He looked instead at his own reflection in the glass wall behind her, adjusting his tie the way a man does when he wants an audience to notice how composed he is, even when there is no audience at all. Insubordination, he said. Repeated. Documented. We gave you every chance we could reasonably give. Denise Harlan sat beside him with a folder thick enough to look serious, most of the pages dated within the last 3 months, each one stamped with the same small red flag. Patient safety concern escalated without authorization. It was a strange kind of crime, Leona thought, to be punished for the exact thing hospitals claim to want most from their staff. She did not reach for a tissue. She did not raise her voice. 12 years on the night shift of an intensive care unit teaches a person exactly which battles are worth spending a reaction on, and this quiet, cowardly little meeting was not one of them. I flagged 3 incorrect medication orders this year, she said, her voice even. 2 of them would have ended in a death that never had to happen. I'll sign whatever paperwork you need signed, Mr. Rieck, but I want it noted on the record that I stand behind every single one of those reports. Duly noted, Rieck said, already rising from his chair, already reaching for his phone as if the conversation had ended several minutes earlier in his mind. Security will walk you out. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Leona had timed longer conversations about which brand of coffee to stock in the break room. She walked back through the unit in silence while her co-workers found sudden, urgent reasons to study their charts instead of meeting her eyes. Nobody said anything. In hospitals, everyone learns quickly that silence is the safest form of sympathy, the kind that can't be reported to anyone upstairs. At her locker, she packed what fit into one cardboard box. A coffee mug with a hairline cracked down one side that she had never once bothered to replace, because it had survived exactly as many overnight shifts as she had. A photograph of her father in his old army uniform, taken the year before he died, the only copy she owned. And folded at the bottom, beneath both, a small worn patch of camouflage fabric that not one person in that building had ever asked her about in 12 years of walking past it clipped to the inside of her badge lanyard. Nobody in that hospital knew what the patch meant. Nobody had ever bothered to ask what a night shift ICU nurse might have done before she became a night shift ICU nurse. She rode the elevator down alone, watching her own reflection in the brushed steel doors. Her face gave nothing away, the same trained stillness that had carried her through a dozen codes and worse. Inside, a very different conversation was running, The kind she never let show on the outside. You did the right thing every single time, she told herself. That has to count for something, even if it doesn't count for anything here. It didn't feel like it counted for much standing in that parking garage, holding a box that smelled faintly of old coffee and hospital hand sanitizer. 12 years of her working life reduced to something she could carry with both arms and a knee to hold the door. She set the box on the passenger seat of her car, sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine, and allowed herself exactly 90 seconds to feel the weight of what had just happened. Then she started the car and drove home, because feeling sorry for yourself past 90 seconds, her old training sergeant used to say, was a luxury nobody in the field could afford, and she had never fully unlearned that lesson. At home, she carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen counter without unpacking a single item from it. She stood there a long moment, looking at it the way a person looks at a chapter they aren't ready to close yet. Then she made herself a real dinner instead of the cereal she usually settled for after a night shift, because routine, even a small and stubborn one, was the only thing that still felt entirely hers. She thought about calling her sister. She decided against it, because her sister would ask the one question Leona didn't yet have a good answer for, and Leona had spent 12 years being the person other people called when they needed a calm voice, not the other way around. She had absolutely no idea that 400 miles away, in a locked room with 3 federal agents and a single laptop screen, her name had just surfaced on a list that almost no one in the entire country was cleared to see. That night, unable to sleep, Leona finally opened the box on the counter. She set the cracked mug in the cabinet where it had always lived. She hung her father's photograph back on the wall in the hallway, exactly where it had hung for 12 years before she ever brought it to the hospital for a bad week she no longer even remembered the reason for. And she held the small camouflage patch in her palm for a long moment before tucking it into the drawer of her nightstand. The same drawer where she kept the one photograph from her service days that she had never once shown a coworker, a young medic and a bandaged senator, both of them still alive, neither of them smiling, taken by a rescue soldier minutes after the extraction. She hadn't looked at that photograph in years. She looked at it now, turned off the lamp, and let herself fall asleep for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit without the weight of the next night's shift waiting on the other side of her alarm clock. To understand exactly why Graham Reich wanted Leona gone so badly, you have to look closely at what she had spent the last 3 months writing down. Harbor Crest's chief of cardiology, Dr. Nolan Beckett, had developed a habit of discharging patients faster than their charts truly supported, and Leona had caught it 4 separate times in 4 separate months. Faster discharges meant fewer bed days billed against insurance averages. Fewer bed days meant cleaner numbers for Reich to present to the hospital board every quarter. And cleaner numbers meant Reich's own performance bonus climbed a little higher each time the spreadsheet updated. Beckett wasn't reckless because he enjoyed cutting corners. He was reckless because, in 11 years at Harbor Crest, nobody above him had ever once told him no in a way that actually mattered to his career. Leona told him no in writing, with a timestamp, every single time she caught it, and she copied the chart notes to a supervising board so there could be no argument later about what she had seen and when she had seen it. The second physician named in her reports was Dr. Julian Cross, a younger doctor still finding his footing 3 years out of residency, who had twice dismissed a patient's complaints as anxiety when Leona's own instincts, sharpened by more overnight hours than Cross had been alive as a licensed physician, told her otherwise. Cross was not the villain in this story. He was simply a man still learning, sometimes the hard way, that a night nurse with 12 years at the bedside could see things a doctor fresh out of training had not yet trained himself to notice. The clearest example sat in the third folder of Denise Harlan's stack, dated 11 weeks earlier. An 80-year-old patient named Walter Combs had been scheduled for discharge by Dr. Beckett on a Friday afternoon, the kind of timing that quietly cleared a bed before the weekend census count. Leona had reviewed his chart during her handoff and noticed his potassium levels trending in a direction that should have delayed him at least another day. She called Beckett directly instead of simply noting it in the chart and moving on. "He's stable enough to go home," Beckett told her over the phone, sounding more tired than annoyed. "His labs say otherwise," Leona answered. "I'm holding him until you recheck in the morning, and I'm documenting the call." Beckett rechecked in the morning. Walter Combs stayed 4 more days and left the hospital walking on his own 2 feet instead of leaving in an ambulance a week later, which was the direction his numbers had been heading. Leona filed a report anyway, because a mistake that gets caught in time is still a mistake worth writing down, so it doesn't happen again to someone with no nurse standing between them and the paperwork. Reich had read every single one of Leona's reports. He didn't dispute them, because he couldn't. Instead, he filed each one in a locked drawer marked Personnel Do Not Distribute, and quietly built a different case altogether. Not that Leona was wrong, because the medical record proved she wasn't, but that Leona was inconvenient. A hospital running on thin margins, he told the board in closed session, could not afford a nurse who kept slowing down the machine with paperwork nobody outside the building would ever read. What Reich never once stopped to consider, in 3 full months of building his case, was who Leona had been before she ever became a night nurse, or what kind of woman spends a decade filing safety reports she knows in advance might cost her the job she loves, simply because she has never learned how to stay quiet when a patient's life is sitting on the line. Down the hall from that locked drawer, a junior nurse named Camille Ortiz had spent 2 years watching Leona train new hires the same steady way every time with short sentences, no wasted motion, hands that moved before her voice ever needed to rise. Camille had once asked Leona, during a slow overnight stretch, why she kept filing reports that never seemed to change anything upstairs. They change something, Leona told her. Just not always the thing you're hoping for right away. You keep the record straight, and eventually the record speaks for itself. Camille didn't yet know how much she was about to miss that steadiness. She would find out in less than 48 hours, on a night when the intensive care unit filled up faster than any of them had ever been prepared for, and the one person who always knew exactly what to do next was no longer allowed inside the building. Before Leona Barrett ever wore a stethoscope inside Harbor Crest Hospital, she wore dog tags and carried a medic kit that weighed more than most of the men she treated. At 26, she served as a combat medic attached to a security detail escorting a young senator named Everett Lang through a region that intelligence reports had promised would stay quiet that week. It did not stay quiet. An explosion tore through the middle of the convoy just after dusk, throwing dust and heat and noise in every direction at once, and within 90 seconds Leona had already dragged the senator's wounded driver into a half-collapsed concrete building while gunfire cracked somewhere close enough to matter. Everett Lang was 31 years old that night, sharp-featured, athletic, already known in Washington as a man who asked too many hard questions of too many powerful people. None of that mattered inside that building. What mattered was a wound low in his side that was bleeding faster than it should have, and a medic kit that had lost half its contents somewhere in the blast. For 47 minutes, in a building with no working lights and no clean water, Leona kept him alive using direct pressure, improvised bandaging cut straight from her own uniform sleeve, and a running, unbroken stream of orders that left absolutely no room in the air for panic to take hold. "Stay with me," she told him again and again, her voice never once climbing above steady. "You are not permitted to die on my shift, Senator. Look at me. Stay with me." He did stay. Somewhere inside those 47 minutes, the shelling in the distance slowed enough that Leona could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears, and she used that rhythm to time his breathing against, counting out loud so he had something steady to hold on to besides pain. She talked to him about nothing important where he grew up, whether he had a dog waiting for him back home, anything that kept his eyes open and fixed on hers instead of drifting toward the dark. He answered in fragments. A sister in Ohio. A dog named Biscuit that chewed through 2 pairs of his good shoes. A mother who still called him every Sunday whether he answered or not. None of it mattered to the mission. All of it mattered to keeping a wounded man tethered to the moment instead of slipping past it. Somewhere between the far-off sound of engines and the smell of dust and blood and scorched concrete, Everett Lang looked up at a 26-year-old medic he had met only hours earlier that same day and said the only sentence he had strength left to say. "If I make it out of this," he told her, "I owe you everything." She told him not to talk. She told him to save his strength for breathing and let her handle the rest. But she never forgot the way he said it, not like a man bargaining with fate to buy himself a few more minutes, but like a man making a promise he fully intended to keep, whatever it eventually cost him. Rescue reached them at the 49-minute mark. Everett Lang survived. Leona was reassigned to a different unit within the month, and their paths never crossed again after that, not through any choice either of them made, but through the quiet, indifferent machinery of military logistics that separates people faster than either side usually wants. She left the service 2 years later and chose nursing over medicine practiced at the edge of a battlefield, believing, the way most people believe about their hardest chapters, that this one had closed completely, with no sequel ever coming. Everett Lang became a senator, then a governor, then, 11 years later, President of the United States. Neither of them ever spoke publicly, at any point, about that night in that building. But somewhere inside a classified personnel file that almost no one was ever cleared to open, one entry remained exactly where it had been left. Medical Asset Priority Clearance directly linked to Protect E. Lang. Nobody at Harbor Crest Hospital had ever been cleared to see that file. Not once in 12 years had anyone at that hospital thought to ask why a night shift nurse's background check always came back sealed instead of simply approved. Until a routine advanced team security sweep, 12 years later, brought that sealed file back up to the surface. at the exact moment it could do the most damage to a man who had just fired her the day before. The morning after her firing, Leona sat alone at her kitchen table, updating a resume she had not touched in over a decade, a cup of coffee slowly going cold beside her keyboard. She typed 12 years of night shift intensive care experience into a template that made none of it sound as hard as it had actually been to live through. She considered applying to the regional VA hospital across town. She considered a private contractor position a former Army friend had mentioned to her once, over drinks, the kind of job that paid well and asked noticeably fewer questions about a person's past. She did not think, not even once, about the White House. At that same hour, 400 miles away, a member of the president's advanced medical team was running a routine security sweep ahead of a confidential outpatient procedure the president had quietly scheduled at a nearby civilian facility, away from cameras and press schedules. Every hospital under final consideration required a pre-cleared roster of medical staff already carrying existing federal security clearance, cross-checked automatically against a national database that almost no one outside a handful of agencies even knew existed. One single name on Harbor Crest's internal roster carried a clearance flag higher than anyone else in that entire building, including the CEO who ran it. That name belonged to a night shift ICU nurse who, according to the hospital's own personnel system, had been formally terminated the previous afternoon at 2:14 p.m. The advanced team lead did not concern himself with hospital politics or personnel disputes. He picked up a secure line and transferred the discrepancy directly to the one office in the entire country that never required an explanation before it was allowed to act. President Everett Lang read the flagged report standing at his own desk, one hand still holding a coffee cup he had forgotten to drink from, and for one long moment he was not the President of the United States at all. He was a 31-year-old man lying on a concrete floor, being kept alive by a 26-year-old medic who refused, again and again, to let him stop talking. He remembered a promise he had made once, in the dark, that he had never fully found a way to repay. "Get her back," he told his chief of staff, setting the coffee down without looking at it. "Today. And find out exactly who made the decision to let her go, and why." His chief of staff, a practical woman named Adrienne Voss who had worked for him since his governorship, didn't ask who Leona Barrett was or why the president's voice had gone this quiet and this precise all at once. She had learned years ago that when he spoke like that, the details would arrive on their own, and the only useful thing she could do in the meantime was move fast. "I'll have it handled within the hour," she said. "Not handled," Lang said. "Fix. There's a difference, and I need it to be the second one." Adrienne made the call herself. She did not raise her voice, because she never needed to when the words behind her were backed by the Oval Office. Denise Harland, 3 states away, answered her own desk phone still holding a cup of coffee she had not yet finished, expecting nothing more dramatic than a scheduling conflict. By 7 o'clock that morning, the security phone at Harbor Crest's front desk was already ringing too. By 9 that same morning, 3 federal agents in plain dark suits were already standing in Harbor Crest's main lobby, and Graham Reich's confident start to the day had already begun coming apart at the seams in front of the entire front desk staff. "There's clearly been some kind of misunderstanding," Reich told the lead agent, a broad-shouldered man named Caldwell who did not blink once at the tone Reich usually used to make employees back down. "We have several excellent physicians on staff who can cover any confidential visit your office requires, on short notice if needed." "The clearance isn't for the hospital," Agent Caldwell said, unmoved. "It's for one specific individual. Nurse Leona Barrett. Where is she right now?" Reich's jaw tightened, though nothing in his voice admitted it outwardly. "She no longer works here as of yesterday afternoon." "Then I'd strongly suggest you fix that," Caldwell said, "before the president's office starts asking why a priority medical asset was terminated one day before a scheduled presidential visit." Reich tried offering 3 other physicians' names before that particular conversation finally ended. Each time, Caldwell repeated the same 6 words back to him, calm and final: "The clearance is not transferable." Reich retreated to his office and called 2 board members in quick succession, his voice climbing an octave higher with each call. The first board member listened politely and said nothing useful. The second asked a single question that Reich had no good answer for. "Why exactly did we fire someone with federal medical clearance the day before a presidential visit?" Reich hung up without answering. He sat behind his desk for a long moment, staring at the termination letter's carbon copy still sitting in his outbox, and for the first time in 3 months of building his careful case against Leona Barrett, he understood that the paperwork he had been so proud of might not protect him after all. Down the hall, Denise Harland sat at her own desk with the same folder she had carried into that glass conference room the day before, And for the first time she let herself actually read Leona's reports instead of simply stamping them and filing them where Reich wanted them filed. Line by line, they read less like insubordination and more like a woman trying to keep other people's parents and children alive against numbers that were never supposed to matter more than a heartbeat monitor. Denise closed the folder, and for reasons she didn't fully explain to herself that morning, she made a copy of it and locked it in her own desk drawer instead of Riek's. While that exchange stalled out in the lobby, the intensive care unit 2 floors up was already unraveling without the one person who had always quietly held it together. Camille Ortiz stood over patient Lorraine Park's monitor at 10:40 that morning, watching numbers that looked almost normal, almost being the exact word that should have worried her sooner than it did. Lorraine's oxygen levels were drifting downward in small, patient increments, the kind of subtle decline the standard bedside alarms simply weren't calibrated to catch in time. 12 years of night shift instinct would have flagged that drift an entire hour earlier, without needing a single alarm to sound at all. Camille had trained under Leona for 2 full years. Standing at that bedside, she knew exactly what was missing from the room, and it wasn't equipment, and it wasn't staffed on paper. It was the one person who could look at a chart and see the story underneath the numbers. Downstairs, Reich was still trying, with visibly less confidence each time, to explain to 3 federal agents why the hospital's most experienced ICU nurse currently had no job. By 11, word of the agents in the lobby had already traveled up through every floor of the hospital the way word always travels fastest through people with nothing to do but wait for test results. Nurses whispered theories to each other at the med cart. Someone said Leona had turned informant. Someone else said she was being arrested. Nobody guessed the truth, because the truth was stranger than anything a rumor mill could invent on its own. Upstairs, a patient was quietly, silently running out of time. And somewhere across town, a black SUV with government plates was already pulling away from Leona Barrett's apartment building, carrying her back toward the exact hospital that had thrown her out less than 20 hours earlier. Leona stepped out of the SUV still wearing the same scrub she had worn the day before, because nobody had given her a single spare minute to change, and 2 federal agents flanked her all the way from the curb to the elevator while hospital staff along the corridor stopped mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-everything, just to watch her walk past. Reich intercepted her near the nurse's station, his voice pitched low and urgent now instead of confident. "You cannot simply walk back into this building after." "She can," Caldwell said, stepping smoothly between them without raising his voice even slightly. "She's operating under direct federal authorization as of this morning. You're welcome to call the White House yourself and confirm it, if you'd like." Leona didn't wait to watch Reich's expression fall apart. She was already moving toward Lorraine Park's bedside, already reading the monitor Camille had been anxiously watching for the last 20 minutes, and within 30 seconds she saw exactly what the standard alarms had completely missed. "Get me Dr. Cross," she said, already reaching for gloves. "Now. This isn't anxiety, and she isn't stable. Her right lung is compensating for a slow bleed nobody's caught yet." Cross arrived at a full run. Within the hour, Lorraine Park was in surgery, and her life had been pulled back from an edge Camille alone would not have seen in time to matter. There was no space left to celebrate. Just after noon, dispatch radios across the entire hospital lit up with the same call, one right after another. A multi-vehicle highway collision, 12 trauma patients inbound, 4 of them critical. Arriving at the exact hour the hospital's halls were already being swept and secured for the president's scheduled visit that afternoon. The intensive care unit that had been dangerously short-staffed all morning was suddenly, without warning, the busiest trauma floor in the entire state. Leona didn't ask anyone for permission. She took control of the floor the same way she had once taken control of a battlefield fast, clear, and without a single wasted word. She sorted incoming patients by severity before the ambulances had even reached the bay doors outside, calling out colors instead of names the way she had been trained to a decade earlier. Red for immediate, yellow for urgent but stable, green for walking and waiting. A trucker with a crushed hand went yellow. A teenage passenger with a collapsed lung went red and straight to Cross. A woman in her 60s, conscious but confused, worried Leona more than her vitals suggested she should, and Leona held her back for a second look instead of clearing her through on a glance, a decision that would matter within the hour when a slow internal bleed finally showed itself on a scan nobody had ordered yet. She pulled Camille onto the most critical case herself, but stood right beside her instead of simply taking it over completely, because a good teacher builds nurses instead of quietly replacing them. "You already know exactly what to do," Leona told her, gripping her shoulder once, firmly. "I'm right here beside you. Move." Camille moved. The floor held together. At the very height of the chaos, the doors at the far end of the hallway swung open, and a man in a tailored dark suit walked in fast, flanked by more federal agents than that hospital had ever seen gathered in one place at once, his eyes scanning the corridor until they landed on a single woman in scrubs directing 4 separate trauma teams at the same time. President Everett Lang had come that afternoon for a scheduled, confidential procedure. What he found instead was the same woman who had once kept him alive on a concrete floor half a world away, still keeping people alive 17 years later, in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic instead of dust and smoke. He didn't interrupt her work. He waited quietly at the edge of the corridor, watching her move from bed to bed, until the last critical patient was finally stable and wheeled off toward surgery. Only then did Leona finally look up and see him standing there. Neither of them said anything grand, or rehearsed, or the kind of thing you'd expect from a movie. He simply said, "Told you I'd owe you everything." She simply said, "You're 17 years late." And for one quiet, ordinary second in a hallway full of noise and motion, 17 years folded down into something that finally, fully made sense to both of them. He stepped closer, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear it over the noise of the corridor. "I looked for you for 2 years after that deployment ended. Every record I pulled came back sealed. I stopped looking eventually, because I was told there was nothing left to find." "There wasn't," she said. "Not the version of me you were looking for, anyway." That woman went home and became someone quieter. "Doesn't look quiet to me," he said, glancing down the hallway at the trauma bay she had just finished commanding. "Looks exactly like the same person who wouldn't let me stop breathing on a concrete floor." She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile the last 2 days had allowed her. "Get some rest, Mr. President. You still have a procedure scheduled, unless you'd like to reschedule your own appointment twice in 1 week." "Only if you're the one running the floor when I come back," he said. "I generally am," she said, and finally allowed herself that smile all the way. The independent review that followed did not take long at all, mostly because the evidence had already been carefully collected by Graham Reich himself, without him ever realizing what he was building. Every write-up he had filed against Leona over the previous 3 months, every time-stamped note meant to construct a case for her termination, became the exact paper trail federal investigators and the hospital's own independent board committee used to prove the opposite case entirely: that a hospital administrator had spent months quietly punishing a nurse for correctly flagging dangerous medical decisions, in order to protect quarterly numbers and his own personal bonus. Dr. Beckett's discharge patterns were placed under formal review by the board, with his continued privileges made conditional on outside oversight. Dr. Cross, to his lasting credit, cooperated fully with investigators from the very first meeting and was given a genuine chance to keep growing under closer supervision, because not every mistake in a story like this one deserves the exact same ending. Graham Reich did not receive that same chance. 2 weeks later, facing a full independent board investigation and the very real possibility of federal charges tied to patient endangerment, he resigned before the board could formally vote to remove him from his position. He left Harbor Crest through the very same lobby he had once ordered Leona escorted out of, carrying a box of his own belongings, with no federal agents waiting outside to make his exit feel important. Leona was formally offered her old position back within the week. She turned it down without much hesitation. She accepted a different position instead, ICU nursing director, with an entirely new charter written directly into her contract at her own insistence. Patient safety reports would never again be quietly filed away in a locked drawer marked "Do Not Distribute." From that point forward, they would go straight to the full board, every single time, without exception. Camille Ortiz was the first name Leona put forward for a new charge nurse position created under the revised charter. When Denise Harland asked if Camille had enough experience yet for that kind of responsibility, Leona answered without hesitating. "She held the floor before I ever walked back in that door," Leona said. "She's earned it twice over." President Lang attended her official reinstatement ceremony in person, an event the hospital had not planned for in advance and did not fully know how to properly host on short notice. He did not give a long speech. He simply told the room, quietly and without notes, that the country had leaders who wore uniforms and leaders who wore scrubs, and that he personally owed his life to one of the second kind. What happened between Leona and Everett after that particular day stayed mostly out of the headlines, exactly the way both of them privately preferred it. But the people closest to Harbor Crest began noticing a black SUV parked outside more evenings than official government business ever seemed to require, and they began noticing their new ICU director smiling in a quiet, private way that none of them had seen from her in 12 full years of working alongside her. A year later, almost to the day, Harbor Crest's intensive care unit ran a mandatory safety training session for every new hire on staff, something Leona had insisted on building into the charter herself. Camille Ortiz, now a full-charge nurse, taught half of it. Leona taught the other half, standing at the front of a room full of nurses barely out of school, telling them the same thing she had once told Camille on a slow overnight shift years earlier. "You keep the record straight," she told them, "even when it feels like nobody upstairs is reading it. Eventually, the record speaks for itself. Sometimes it takes longer than you'd like, but it always does." In the back of the room, unannounced and without his usual security detail crowding the doorway, President Everett Lang stood quietly by the window, listening to every word, exactly the way he had once listened to a young medic's voice keeping him tethered to a night he almost didn't survive. Here is what this story leaves behind. Once the sirens finally go quiet, doing the right thing rarely feels rewarded in the exact moment it costs you something. Leona spent 3 long months being quietly punished for the very thing that eventually saved her entire career, and it took a debt 17 years old to finally balance that scale back out. Most of us will never have a president walk down our hallway to personally set things right. But every single one of us has a choice, right now, today, to be the kind of person who tells the truth anyway, even when the room full of people around us clearly wants us to stay quiet instead. That is the whole point of a woman like Leona Barrett. She was never loud. She was simply right over and over again, for 12 straight years, until the world finally caught up to her. If this story kept you here all the way to the very end, that already tells me something true about you. Subscribe to see how stories like this one keep unfolding, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I would truly love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going together.